everyone, this is writing micro lesson number 7 on writing effective conclusions for Honors 111 in the Civilization sequence of the Honors College at the University of Maine, and I'm the instructor, Rob Glover. So today we're going to talk about conclusions. Conclusions are important. They are not merely a throwaway. They are not an afterthought. They are an important part of your essay, of your paper, of your writing in general. So a conclusion is going to be your last word. So oftentimes if you're reading something, you'll remember what is said last most prominently, and you want to try to ensure that you have an impact on your reader, that you say things that resonate with your reader as you're signing off. It's also an opportunity for synthesis, and synthesis is a little bit different than summary. So synthesis, you're bringing ideas together. You're pulling together the disparate ideas in your paper into a cohesive whole. And so conclusions can play an important role in kind of distilling down and condensing the various threads of thought that are running through your paper. And it's also an area in which you have a lot of freedom in relation to the rest of the essay. So in other parts of the essay, you might be bound by the need to quickly provide context and present a thesis statement or provide evidence to support your main ideas. But in the conclusion, you have a lot of different ways that you can approach how you're going to write what you want to write. And you have a lot of autonomy in the decisions you make as a writer. So how can we be more intentional in crafting our conclusions? Well, I'll start off with some things to avoid. The first thing would be, and you've probably seen this in some of your writing if you use this phrase, avoid using constructions like in conclusion or summing up, right? These are constructions that make perfect sense when you are communicating orally. So if you were part of a debate team and you were giving your opening argument, it would make sense to use in conclusion because your audience doesn't know if you're coming to the end of what you're saying. If you're reading a paper, your reader knows when you're coming to the end. They can sense that they're on the last page or, that they don't see very many words left on the paper. So it's unnecessary and it can look kind of amateurish in your writing. You also want to avoid simply repeating or summarizing what's in your introduction. So sometimes I'll see conclusions that are basically reworded versions of the introductory paragraph. That is a lost opportunity. You should be doing something more than simply restating the first thing that you said in your paper. You also want to own your viewpoint or the argument that you've defended. Sometimes folks get to the conclusion of their paper and they start pointing out the shortcomings in what they've argued or, kind of gaps. And you don't want to do that, right? Finish strong and don't feel the need to apologize for or qualify your viewpoint. You also don't want to introduce something entirely out of left field. So sometimes in a conclusion, you'll introduce an entirely new point, and then you really don't have the space to defend it or even articulate it, to expand upon it and provide context for it. So conclusions are really summing up and bringing things to a close and a conclusion, right? And you don't want to be introducing new ideas at that point in your paper. Other times I will read a paper and it will just seem as if it ends abruptly, like it just stops. And sometimes I think what happens is individuals get to a word length requirement or they're exhausted and they stop. They say, that is good enough in that last paragraph. And in general, you want to be more intentional in constructing your conclusion than that. You don't want to simply just kind of look at the last thing that you've written and say, oh, that looks good enough, and then save it and turn it in. So those are some things to avoid, just some general advice that if you're doing these things or you have done these things, try to break those habits. So what should you strive for in a conclusion? Well, one thing that you want to try to provide in your conclusion is something about the significance. So your reader, they might have read what you've written and you've defended it well and you've advanced an argument, and they may find themselves saying, okay, interesting, so what? Who cares? Why should I care? Why does this matter? And there's a number of different ways in which you can try to make that clear for your reader, but be thinking that as you're writing, that, all right, I'm defending an argument, I'm advancing an idea, but what is the actual significance of that idea? Why should a reader care about it? And that could be some link to, a larger question. That could be something that's still relevant in our contemporary world. That could be just, really anything. But you should make some conscious attempt to argue why this is significant. You also want to link your conclusion to your thesis statement. Now, as I said, that doesn't mean that you simply summarize and restate your introductory paragraph, but you want to think about the points that you've made in the body of your paper, which should be related to the thesis statement, and find some way to synthesize those in the conclusion. Pull that together, right? Distill that down to a couple sentences. There's other things that you can do in your conclusion. You can use provocative questions or quotes or anecdotes, or you can reference something that came up in the introduction. If you used a personal anecdote or a really compelling story to start your essay, you can refer back to it in the conclusion. And for your reader, that's going to provide a sense of finality. It's going to provide a sense that they've gone on a journey and they've reached a clear endpoint. And the journey has made sense. It's been continuous and organized around a core idea or question. If you're writing about something that has practical implications, if the answer to the question that you've asked or the argument that you've made is in some way related to something that could happen, something that's dangerous, something that's imminent, then you can use that conclusion to paint a picture of those implications or that scenario that might play out, right? And that can be also a really compelling way to end a paper. Also, in general, we try to avoid, overgeneralizing, but on the basis of the argument that you've made in your paper, sometimes the conclusion is the place where you can universalize or you can generalize what you've stated and what you've argued, right? So if there's some broader implication to what you've argued, then you can make a general statement now supported by the evidence and the arguments that you've supported throughout your paper, right? So you can suggest some broad continuities to other situations. You can say, this seems like a very narrowly focused question, but in fact it is an example of a much larger problem or circumstance. So those are some things that you should be thinking about doing in your conclusion. You probably can't do them all, but certainly the significance and providing some sort of a link to your thesis statement and the arguments that you've made within your paper are things that should be appearing in every conclusion. So what are some guidelines for effective conclusions? These are the three things that I'm going to focus on in this week's writing assignment. One is continuity. So that idea of linking the thesis statements and the body of the essay to what you're providing in your conclusion. Your conclusion should seem related to what's come before it. I know that that seems kind of straightforward, but there should be a clear linkage between what you've set out to do in a thesis statement, what you've argued in the paper, and what you're doing in the conclusion. There should also be value added, so it should go a step further. It should provide some generalization or warning, or perhaps offer a call to action, something that we can actually do to influence the situation. And lastly, it should be vivid and engaging. So there's many different ways to do this. This is one of those areas in which you have a lot of freedom, but it needs to evoke something for your reader. It can't simply be a restatement of the arguments that you've made. It needs to be something more than that. And you need to think about ways in which you can make a conclusion vivid and engaging. So here's an example of a conclusion. This is from an article that's a couple years old. And basically the article is a journalistic article. It was in Time magazine. And it was talking about motherhood in the context of a digitized age. So what is it like to be a mother in an era in which we are projecting ideal types and images of motherhood on social media? And so the title of the article is Motherhood is Hard to Get Wrong, so why do so many moms feel so bad about themselves? And I think this is a good conclusion. Now, it's very different than the type of conclusion that you might write in your honors class, in which a lot of it is textual analysis. And particularly in the first year, you're dealing with things, texts that are hundreds, if not thousands of years old. But I think the general guidelines for writing a conclusion are similar across these different types of writing. So here's the conclusion. I'm just going to read it and then talk about it a little bit. So the author, Claire Howarth, says, "Motherhood in the connected era doesn't have to be dominated by any myth. Social media can just as easily help celebrate our individual experience and create community through contrast. Moms have to stick together as we walk our separate paths. We have to spot the templates and realize that there are no templates. We have to talk about our failures and realize that there are no failures." So I like the language there. I like the fact that these are very direct and concise sentences, and you get a sense of authenticity. The author really kind of knows what they're talking about. You can presume that from this, they've been making arguments about the influence that social media has upon perceptions of motherhood and the ways that mothers feel about themselves. And there's probably been some anecdotal evidence of ways in which mothers have been made to feel bad, and how social media can project an image of motherhood that ultimately is an artificial creation, right? But it's pulling together in a way that goes beyond mere summary some of that evidence that's appeared earlier in the article and really distills down the major point that the author wants to make. And it's also a call to action, right? So when I talked about different ways that you can be vivid and engaging with your reader as you sum up, this is saying we have to spot the templates and realize that there are no templates. So this is something we have to do as a society. We have to talk about our failures and realize that there are no failures. So we have to open a dialogue, and that dialogue that we initiate has to change the way that we think about something. So you're given, well, kind of like marching orders from this conclusion. And the reader who walks away from that piece is going to be compelled to think about something in a different way, presumably, right? If they actually read it closely and they've thought about what it's asking them to do. So I think that's an example of a good conclusion. Now, the conclusion is going to vary slightly based on the type of thing that you're writing about, but this is an example of some of those strategies put into practice. There's plenty of additional guidelines on writing conclusions. I've given you a few links here. So the University of North Carolina Writing Center has some good tips and tools on conclusions, and also the University of Richmond. Their writing center's website is called the Writer's Web, and they have some good kind of general information about conclusions. The other piece of advice I would give you on conclusions and just writing generally is read lots of work. Read other people's essays, read articles and stories that are written online, read journalism, read books, read nonfiction books, read fiction books, and look at how individuals conclude their writing. And usually they're doing so very strategically and very intentionally. And do your best to try to pick up some lessons and try to learn from the really good writing that's out there. Some of those tools can become part of your own personal writer's toolbox. So I'll wrap up there, and I look forward to reading your work.